Thanks, Betsy. That's the end of the bio. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming out tonight. It was a big and busy day for me, and perhaps for some of you as well, so I appreciate your being here on a Thursday evening. Thank you to Betsy and the Portland Art Museum for the invitation. The Artist Talk series has welcomed many people who I greatly admire, and it's an honor to be a part of the Artist Talk series. I also want to acknowledge a few of my mentors without whom I wouldn't be here speaking to you today. And specifically, I'm thinking of Tawny Holt and Linda Austin, Heather Kravis, and many others who I'm very grateful for their presence in my life. Those are three women who invited me into the world of dance, and I'm very grateful to them. So here we are tonight. I thought that I would start off with a little story about the first time when I encountered the work of the artist Dan Flavin. And this takes us back to the year 2012 and a road trip that I took to Marfa in West Texas. So Marfa is a very tiny town. Can I see a raise of hands for anyone who's been to Marfa? You've been to Marfa? You've been to Marfa? Okay, cool. So I was approaching this trip to Marfa as a research project, an artistic research project for my work as an artist. To give a little context about where I was at as a person working in the arts, I had just finished the year prior a project called All Night Dance. These are my notes. I'd finished a project called All Night Dance that was what the title entailed, an all-night dance. It started at 8 p.m. and it went until 7 a.m. And it was a project which focused on dancing in nightclubs and created a space for that. And that was the culmination of this work which I had done into club dancing and a project which I called Intensive Dance. And I had released this essay in the form of a little self-produced book the same year as the Intensive Dance project. So that had finished, and that was my first real project which I had ever done as an artist. And I had met at that time Andra Rotaru, who is a Romanian poet, and we were beginning to form this collaboration that would end up taking the shape of a book of poetry in Romanian, which I don't understand, but which I've read some of the English translation of the first chapter, and a dance performance. And we shared a central character named Lemur. So that project took about 2 years to realize, and the trip to Marfa was at the beginning of that interaction, that collaboration with Andra. So I went to Marfa wanting to increase and broaden my exposure to the arts, and I was going with a group of people who I loved very dearly, and who I still love very dearly. 7 of us packed into a rental van, and we drove from Portland down to San Francisco, picked up a few more people, San Francisco down to Pasadena, and then in the final trip of our journey, we drove from Pasadena to Marfa. And you know how if you are in a group and you are traveling and you're doing a project together, sometimes the responsibility for keeping track of time kind of falls on no one and everyone. And it must have been about 10 p.m. when we had stopped for dinner before someone realized that we still were about 6 hours away from Marfa. And we had been driving, we left Pasadena also at around 10 p.m., so we'd been on the road for about 12 hours at that point. There was kind of people throwing up their hands in the air, and a lot of people just fell asleep after that dinner. But I and my friend Luca picked up this last leg of the trip, driving through the desert in the middle of the night. And I remember it very vividly because I had never been to that part of the United States, and the geography is quite dramatic. So driving through the desert at night, you really have a black on black landscape in that there's the black of the sky, and then there's the black of the hills and the plains. And that's entirely uninterrupted by any electric light. And we were on these lonely highways for several hours, coasting towards Marfa. And at a certain point, we knew that we were getting really close, because just off in the distance, you could see this lit up point on the horizon. And my buddy Luca, who was up with me at 3 in the morning or whenever, said, "Oh, that's the Prada Marfa." And I'd heard about the Prada Marfa, but for those of you who don't know, it's a full-size Prada store, which was installed by a couple of European artists in 2005, named Elm Green and Dragset. And we didn't even stop, which kills me, because it was a beautiful sight amid the darkness to see this Prada shop completely lit up with the lights that you would have on a retail shop. And we did stop on the way out during daytime, but it wasn't quite as magical. Still, that was my introduction to Marfa at 3 a.m. The next day, when we woke up, I followed our hosts who were letting us couch surf on their various nooks and crannies in their homes. And they were having a rehearsal. Almost everyone who was hosting us was part of a rehearsal for Beckett's Threepenny Opera in a beautiful theater called the Crowley Theater, I believe, there in Marfa. And I was able to sit in on the rehearsal of this very big work of theater that this very small town was producing. So double magic already within the first 24 hours in Marfa. On July 4th, which was kind of the occasion for our visit there, I was in a chicken coop where we had emptied it out, and they had put ice in the troughs where the chickens would eat their feed, and we'd thrown a whole bunch of beer in there. And there was this like soul music going on, and I was really into dancing because that's what I do. And I was really feeling myself, and this was kind of my moment. This was part of my artistic research. This is why the trip was a tax write-off. I am there researching the link between this intensive dance body of work, which was me dancing in clubs, and whatever was going to happen next. And we had kind of heard rumors that Beyonce and Solange were in town, because our friend was like, "Oh yeah, they're gonna come into town for July 4th, and they need to buy all the weed. So everyone needs to drop everything so we can go get them some weed." And that happened. And then as I'm clubbing, my friend Nicole runs up to me and she's like, "Robert, Beyonce and Solange are here." And I was like, "That's cool, but I cannot be bothered. I cannot be bothered to break out of this flow of affect and this transformation beyond my subjectivity. I cannot reconstitute myself as a person in relationship to those celebrities." And I did not even see them that night in the chicken coop. But they were there, apparently. I did run into them the next day at a restaurant. A glamorous small town with one stoplight in it. That's Marfa, Texas. And that was the location of my first encounter with Dan Flavin's work. So Marfa is a place where they installed a mock Prada store, and where there's it's a kind of a mecca in an oasis, at least, in West Texas. In large part because of Donald Judd, who moved there from New York City to set up his artistic practice, I believe, in the 70s. Donald Judd and Dan Flavin were good friends, as far as I understand. And that was where I first encountered Dan Flavin's installation, which was realized in the year of his passing in 1996. So that installation, Untitled, the Marfa Project, inhabited 6 U-shaped buildings, and those U-shaped buildings were bisected to make 2 L's. And essentially you would go in to the building, and at the end of the corridor, there was light that was kind of curving around the corner. There's no windows along the walls, but you'd be drawn in to see the source of the light. And as you turned the corner, you would be faced with a wall of diagonal fluorescent tubes, one facing you, one color facing you, maybe 12 bulbs, all in diagonals, and another color on the reverse side. So there might be a yellow facing one way and a row of blues facing the other. And ever since that day, I had been interested in what Dan Flavin was doing as an artist, and I kind of marvel at the impact that that generation of minimalist sculptors had on art in the United States. So Dan Flavin was a funny dude, interesting guy, with all due respect. Everything I'm about to tell you, I learned last week on the internet. So I'm not an art historian, and I don't want to be speaking from a position of authority. Everything is subject to be wrong that I tell you, but I think that I did a pretty good job of covering some of the basics. Just to acknowledge, I read a Guardian newspaper article on Dan Flavin's work and an essay that was on the Chinati Foundation's website. So Dan Flavin was born in 1933 in Brooklyn, and he studied art in New York City at the New School and at Columbia. He worked as a mailroom attendant. This is where it falls apart. He was a guard and elevator operator at the Museum of Modern Art and a mailroom clerk at the Guggenheim in his late 20s. So, kind of like standard aspiring artist working at these major arts institutions. And I love the fact that he was a mailroom clerk at the Guggenheim and would later go on to install an epic column of fluorescent tubes in the main rotunda there later on in his career. In his first works that he made, he called icons, and he made them with his first wife. The icons were these laborious mixed media contraptions that did include fluorescent bulbs as well as incandescent bulbs. And they would also have wood and masonite and formica, which are things I don't know about. I don't know what those materials are, but they were mixed media works, right? And they were involved an element of craft, let's say. That's the key point. We could argue there's an element of craft here as well, and you could argue there's none at all. The first time that he worked with fluorescent tubes, he took one of these, as far as I understand, it was this color. It was the gold 8-foot-long fluorescent tube. He put it at a 40-degree angle on the wall of his studio in Brooklyn, with the lower part of the casing nearly touching the floor. And he called it The Diagonal of Personal Ecstasy, which is a really great title. Or The Diagonal of May 25th, 1963. He was 31 years old. From then, for the next 33 years of his life, until his death in 1996, he produced over 500 works using exclusively the materials of fluorescent tubes, and fixtures. All of these materials were store-bought and commercially available, so they were all mass-produced. He worked with 10 colors, including 4 shades of white, and 4 different sizes: 2-foot, 4-foot, 6-foot, and 8-foot fluorescent tubes. Those were his formal constraints throughout 500 works that were realized, and many more which I understand exist in the form of drawings. Part of the way that Flavin developed as an artist was he started on the wall with fluorescent bulb installations, and then he began to create barriers, such as this one, which is a barrier to the corner, and he also made other architectural interventions. Another development in his work with fluorescent tubes was to place the tubes in 2 different directions, projecting light out into space and back up on the wall. He had been working with fluorescent tubes for 8 years when he made this piece in 1971. This is Untitled, to Donna 2. Donna was a person who worked, her full name was Donna Veccarono. She worked at the Ace Gallery in Los Angeles, and that was where the first exhibition of these works occurred in 1971. There was Untitled to Donna, Untitled to Donna 2, Untitled to Donna 3, 4, 4A, 5, and 5A. And he associated, this is in the catalog notes that I was provided, he associated the gaudiness of these colors with Los Angeles. So a nice little nudge in the elbow, or nudge in the ribs, right? Elbow in the ribs. Pam acquired the sculpture in 1981 from Donna at the Ace Gallery. And one thing that I thought was fascinating was there's a period of time when it appeared that these tubes in these colors were no longer going to be available. They were going to be discontinued. And the Portland Art Museum dropped a couple $1,000s and bought a 50-year supply of 8-foot-long fluorescent tubes in these colors. Talking with the chief preparator, or sending some emails back and forth, it was great to get some responses. They burn out about once a year, and other than that, they have had to make some structural adjustments to the fixtures themselves, but it seems to keep humming along. I don't see it, but apparently Flavin asked that the Union decals be left on and visible on the outsides of the fixtures whenever possible. It kind of looks like there's white tape on, anyway. I'm not going to get into it. The key point is that these were store-bought, right? And indeed, you could go to a store and buy these fixtures, and if you could find these colored tubes, you could buy these tubes and make this exact sculpture in maybe a day, and have a replica of a Dan Flavin. What gives it its authenticity is a certificate, which is signed by the artist, and of course is very valuable, and they wouldn't let me touch it. I asked, I was like, that would be great. So Flavin was a funny dude. Like Donald Judd, he rejected the term minimalism. He would not want himself to be considered, or he didn't consider himself a minimalist. He didn't consider his work to be sculpture, and he emphatically denied that he was drawing with light, which some had written because of his use of line, strong use of line when you're dealing with fluorescent tubes. He also resisted the idea that his work was in any way transcendent. There's a quote which is often associated with Flavin: "It is what it is, and it ain't nothing else. Everything is clearly, openly, and plainly delivered." And isn't it a friendly sculpture? Doesn't it just beckon you to get near it. That's, I think, what I appreciate the most about this sculpture and about Flavin's work is its sense of invitation. And I think you could argue that as soon as you turn the corner, you are involved in the work. One of the interesting things that I read when I was doing research for this talk is this idea that Flavin's use of color was an addition to art history. That was his contribution to art history. And an interesting aspect of it is that he is occupying space with invisible light, which only is made visible when it has a reflective surface. So that's dramatically illustrated by the corners that he would use and this amazing flattening of space, flattening of depth. But I also really appreciate that whenever people walk next to the sculpture, they are equally a part of it as a reflective surface. And there was a great little moment when Betsy and I first met here around the sculpture when these teenagers who were really cute and really artsy looking came by and they were like, "Hey, excuse me, could you take a photo of us in front of the sculpture?" And it was just such a perfect moment that they wanted to have their photo taken with it. And also I remember in Marfa, we took a bunch of photos despite the prohibition, which was just ridiculous. I mean, how could you resist taking a photo with this sculpture? There's something so interactive about it. And also, if I slow down a minute, one of the things that I value the most in art is the ability for art to facilitate an experience that is real and immediate, but in which I cannot recognize myself as the person experiencing it. And I guess that could be applied to all abstract art, but I feel it quite strongly with this particular sculpture due to its sense of invitation, as well as its dramatic effects on the wall, this kind of 1-2 punch that it has of the direct yellow light and the indirect lights mirroring their source on the wall. It's all a very sensual experience to me. And at this point, I'd like to shift into the part of the talk where I talk about a few ideas that I have arrived at to help me articulate my experience of art. And one of those ideas is this distinction between perception and sensation. To do that, I'm going to read a little bit from an essay which I wrote for a dance piece that Tawny Holt had made called Duet Love. So my intent here is to give you a bit of background on Flavin, and I want you to walk away tonight with a bit of an understanding of who I am as an artist. And I want you to walk away with a few tools, conceptual tools, which you might use to navigate your own experience of artworks. I'm also going to do a dance performance, if you didn't know about that. Just a few other housekeeping things, just at this random middle point of the talk. We won't have a formal Q&A because it would be weird after the dance performance, but I would love to talk with you in the reception where there's wine, which apparently, I don't know if they said this, but they paired wine with what they read on my artist statement on my website and with Dan Flavin's work. I hope that still happened, and I'm not overpromising. Anyway, here's what I'm going to read to you about speaking of sensations. Okay, I like to consider the distinction between perception and sensation as it pertains to dance viewership. The things that I discern as I attend a given dance are my perceptions. Perceptions are what I'm consciously aware of during a performance. Lucy looked excellent with the flannel around her waist and the collared shirt and the disheveled hair. Allie directed her gaze one way while directing the rolling light another, while Keon walked downstage on the center line with a spotlight squarely on the wall behind him. I register these thoughts and I index them in the part of my memory that holds out until the end of the performance so that I have something smart to say after the show. Of course, sometimes these perceptions lodge in our minds more deeply and persist there for years to come, inscribed as another layer in the body of experience we bring with us to our seats. That said, perceptions far from account from the totality of my experience when I am attending dance or with a work of art. What is produced in me as the embodied subject who attends a given dance are my sensations. Indeed, perceptions are a form of sensation, but perceptions are by definition conscious, whereas sensations can just as easily be unconscious. Excessive and unruly, disobedient to principles of perceptual organization, and often diagonal to language production. Sensation can include, but is not limited to, interest, exhaustion, elation, bemusement, boredom, inspiration, frustration, a numb ass, disdain, expansion, self-consciousness, a desire to urinate, emotion, a rapid heartbeat, or nodding off. Sensation always inflects our perceptions, but it isn't always accounted for. For instance, I get so hangry. Attending a dance performance is one of the exceptionally rare occasions in my contemporary life where the option to press pause or simply get up and grab a snack is not a viable one. I wonder what would happen if I got up in the middle of a performance or in the middle of this artist talk and went out to get a hot dog and came back and I ate the hot dog. I don't even know if I could do it. Would they even let me back in with a hot dog? Everybody would hate me or want a bite. Point being, if I'm not mindful, my irritable self is prone to project its local sensation onto the dance or onto the work of art. I didn't eat dinner, therefore this dance is enervating, dull, listless. Sensation affects perception. Our existential conditions reflect back through the prism of time-based art. This is a powerful asset of live art forms as well as a terrific liability. And then a little section that gets to the heart of why I'm drawn to these kinds of abstract disidentification facilitating experiences. As someone who lives in a neoliberal social order, I privilege perceptions over sensations in my economically operative daily life. To achieve tasks, I must perceive effectively. Those 20 emails I need to write get written much better when I leverage a willed and normative constraint on the scope of my lived experience. All this to say that when I'm considering dance or any contemporary art, I feel a critical need to clean up and reconsider the interface between sensation and perception. Sharing time with live arts allows me to interrupt and complicate the conditioned efficiency of my perception. Performances are exceptional, and in their window of exception, I try and rejig the dynamic between perception and sensation, so to give the latter a bit more sway. So that was from an article that I wrote as a dramaturg for a dance piece by Tony Holt called Duet Love. And a more simple way to think about sensations and perceptions might be illustrated with Post-it notes. So if I consider the Post-it note to be a perception, it's something which I can identify and discern as a yellow square. That perception is also in the field of sensation. Again, the perception is something that's conscious, and the sensation might just as well be unconscious. My perception of the Dan Flavin sculpture includes its very transparent, basically open source components, as well as some of its more optically confusing and curious effects. And yet, that perception doesn't account for my full experience of the Dan Flavin sculpture, because there's also this whole realm of sensation which I value really above most else in my encounters with art. And I think that the aspect of sensation that I appreciate the most is that it allows my sense of self to be porous, and it allows me to feel a greater connection to things beyond myself. When I talk about being a neoliberal subject, I'm talking about being someone who's very self-interested, who's very productive, and who feels traumatized by the way that our society promotes a kind of atomized individualism. All that to say that sensation is one of the concepts that I use when I am trying to articulate my experience of many art forms. And I think the distinction between sensation and perception can be really useful. Two other concepts that I want to leave you with are the distinction between the actual and the virtual, which runs parallel or is perhaps even synonymous to the possible and the potential. To talk about those concepts, I'm going to bring in a few other voices that aren't my own, and I'll finish the talk portion tonight by reading from some of these essays which I wrote to try to articulate my experience of dancing in nightclubs. Specifically, this is a product of a period of time when I would go out to after-hours clubs in Montreal. And after-hours clubs are clubs that open at 2 a.m. and close around noon. And I would go there dead sober and pay a lot of attention to my experience. And I would also dance like crazy. I would dance like really crazy. Perhaps a weird way of encountering dancing clubs, but I worked with my thesis advisor at university to articulate this project, which later became called Intensive Dance. And that drew upon this one work, which I would highly recommend you check out if you're interested in this stuff, called The Parables for the Virtual by Brian Masumi, who is a post-Deleuzian critical theorist, and it's a brilliant book. Another brilliant thinker is Aaron Manning, also a Deleuzian and someone who I met when I was in Montreal. I'll pick it up here. Inflection. Aaron Manning, a scholar of relational art and philosophy, guides us to the interval in between movement. So again, our focus here is on actual and virtual. This is a quote from Aaron Manning's essay, The Elasticity of the Almost, which can be found in Planes of Composition, a text that was edited by Andre Lepecki and Jen Joy. Sustained by the movement itself, the triangulated interval folds into an intensive expansion, or an expansive intensity, languidly holding the moment. This holding is not structural. It is elastic. It is almost the next movement, but not quite yet. This elasticity of the almost is the intensive extension of the movement. A moment when anything can happen. The next movement has not yet come. The past movement is passing. No step is taken, and yet in the elastic, the micro-perception of every possible step can almost be felt. I was at a meeting of something called the Sense Lab that was coordinated by Aaron Manning and Brian Masumi in Montreal. And I got involved in a research creation around this concept of inflection. And basically what it entailed was that you would be with a partner and you would lean until you were about to fall over. And right when you were about to fall over, a partner or two people would push you in a direction that you couldn't really foresee. And the key was to focus on that moment before you tip over. I was thinking of doing it tonight, but I was like, it's probably not the best idea. So as you're tipping, that moment right before you actually make a choice as to where you're gonna step, that is the moment that Aaron Manning is kind of focusing on. And I'll just kind of pick this up. The present can become pregnant with a charge from the virtual. Even if we know that movement must actualize in a specific inflection in the next instant, it's not next yet. This is the suspended tension which the intensive dancer cultivates between the alluring impossibility of potential's defiant lean into actuality and the necessity of a singular resolution. The intensive dancer uses movement to dynamically host the compelling field of potential. Back to Aaron Manning, she says, the labyrinth of folds virtually active in the interval are becoming bodies of movement. They are not steps, nor can they be translated as such. They are potential directions, potential elasticities, potential pre-accelerations. Separating them out is impossible. Their indivisibility is what gives the interval its intensity. So this concept of intensity is being linked to this idea of the virtual. And I was really drawn to what happens when you dance for a long time and it becomes less actual and more about virtualness. Not illustrating that right now. How's about one more? I gotta choose. I'm gonna do two more, sorry. We hold these truths to be self-evident. One, a perspective drawn from Lacanian psychoanalysis assumes that each of us conduct our daily lives through a functional yet ultimately fictional sense of individual identity. In the words of prominent Lacanian Slavoj Žižek, we are dealing with a symbolic fiction, but a fiction which, for contingent reasons that have nothing to do with its inherent nature, possesses performative power, is socially operative, structures the socio-symbolic reality in which I participate. That's from Slavoj Žižek, The Ticklish Subject. 2, we perceive only what our consciousness can make sense of from an otherwise overwhelming amount of immediate sensory information. What we perceive as reality is in fact a useful and intelligible shorthand, a kind of functional hallucination derived from a more complex present. The remainder of this utilitarian reduction doesn't cease to exist. Rather, sensation picks up where perception leaves off. Parallel to our perception of the actual runs a sensation of the virtual that accompanies every instant. Such sensation can influence our conscious appreciation of the present in the form of feelings or affects. A virtual dimension always coincides with and exceeds our actually perceived reality. Sensation of this can transform fixed ideas of possibility into dynamic forces of potentiality. Cultivating both the dynamism of potential and its capacity to move us beyond what we think possible is a primary operation of intensive dance. And a last section here that'll lead us into a little bit of a performance. A lot of purity, these are not my words, this is a thinker, Mario Perniola. He says, a lot of purity, honesty, and even candor are necessary to become clothing. Mario Perniola's text, The Sex Appeal of the Inorganic, presents a consideration of a thing that feels, thing as a fourth category alongside human, God, and animal. Perniola's idea that skin can be clothing helps us approach the impersonal posture the intensive dancer has assumed towards its hosting body. The offering of, these are Perniola's words now, the offering of one's own body as extraneous clothing, not to pleasure or to someone else's desire, but to an impersonal and insatiable speculative excitement that never tires of traversing it, penetrating it, wearing it, and that enters, insinuates, sticks into us, opening us toward a complete exteriority in which everything is surface, skin, fabric. I'm gonna leave that little theory dust in the air, and I'm going to ask that this space be cleared. The back row of stools is totally perfect, but if we could move these stools to a different location. Sitting on the floor is really great up here. I need this spare area cleared. This area is great. All this area is great. You can say hello to your neighbor. It's going to take me just a minute to derobe. Oh, I don't need this on. Solo takes about 15 to 20 minutes, and at the end of it, that will be the conclusion of the talk. This is